Welcome back. By the end of 1915, the Gallipoli campaign had ended in defeat, retreat, and the death of more than 8,000 diggers. But far worse horrors lay ahead on the Western Front. In the mud and the trenches of Europe, a further 50,000 Australian soldiers would make the ultimate sacrifice. No one could imagine the carnage that would be triggered by Serbian terrorist Gavrilo Princip when he assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now the family of that lone assassin claims he's a hero. The Somme Valley in France lies at the epicentre of the infamous Western Front, a 750-kilometre line that ran from Belgium through France to the Swiss border. Today's bucolic charm is a stark contrast to the epic carnage of a century ago. In 1914, on his way to war, the English poet Rupert Brooke wrote those famous patriotic lines, "If I should die, think only this of me, that there's a corner of some foreign field that is forever England." Those words resonated around the empire, and no more so than in Australia. But what we couldn't know at the beginning was how many men would be dead by the end. No foreign field would be big enough to contain them.
On Gallipoli, we lose 8,700 soldiers in the 8.5 months of the campaign, and we think that's bad. But then the bulk of our Australian Imperial Force goes on to the Western Front, and 40 to 46,000 Australians die on the Western Front.
How do our losses stack up against those of our allies?
Australia had one of the highest per capita loss rates of any participant nation in the First World War.
The cemetery at Villers-Bretonneux is our main memorial in France. Not only are over 1,000 soldiers buried here, there is a roll of 11,000 missing diggers whose bodies were never found, blown to pieces in the killing fields of Fromelles, Bullecourt, and, according to military historian Brad Monera, the most notorious of all, Pozières.
Between the 23rd of July and the 6th of August, some 23,000 Australians are killed or injured. You know, when Bean came here after the war, our great Australian historian, he stood on this spot and said, "There is no place on earth more sown with Australian sacrifice."
23,000? But when we first entered the war, we thought we'd be committing about 20,000 men.
That's right. I mean, this just completely changes Australia's attitude to the war.
By 1916, the Australian public was learning there was nothing great or noble about this war. Millions of men died on the Western Front, and plenty were murdered because both sides often had a policy of taking no prisoners. Donovan Joint, a Victoria Cross winner, made sure this chilling account was entered into our official war history.
And Joint said, "I could see a young Australian with an equally young German prisoner. The German was begging for his life, and the Australian assumed a look of disgust because he didn't have his bayonet fixed. And so he held the German down while he fixed his bayonet and drove it through the German's chest." And I think that it's an important story that we've got to tell. You know, these are ordinary Australians under extraordinary circumstances.
Whatever it takes.
I think that's why I attend Anzac Day marches.
And Anzac Day holds special significance not just in Australia, but here in the village of Villers-Bretonneux, with kangaroos at the entrance to the town hall.
On Anzac Day 1918, this town, Villers-Bretonneux, burns its way into Australian military history.
With the war entering its 4th year, the Germans launched Operation Michael, a massive last-ditch assault through the Somme Valley and then on to Paris. In April, they reclaimed Villers-Bretonneux, a critical staging point in their quest for victory.
just after last light, 2 Australian brigades are ordered to retake the place. The city's on fire. And at midnight on Anzac Day 1918, the Australians are fighting on the outskirts of this place. Their German enemy are silhouetted by the flames of this town burning. This really was desperate. In some cases, hand-to-hand fighting. The Australians retook this village at bayonet point.
Might this have been our most important engagement in the war?
I think you can say that. I think that if the Germans had been able to keep this town, rebuild and potentially advance again,
History might have been entirely different.
history would have been different.
The people of Villers-Bretonneux have never forgotten the diggers, and this town, indeed the entire Western Front, is now overtaking Gallipoli as a pilgrimage for Australians.
Infantry Battalion, that's your great uncle.
Chris and Ross McDiven from Sydney both lost relatives in the Great War. Who have you got here?
Great uncle William Ross, the private, is my husband's name is Ross because his first name was named after him, and that's his great uncle.
Is it important for you to come here and see that name?
Oh, it is. Well,
absolutely.
we found quite a few
Fantastic.
graves in the last 3 days.
Yeah.
For me, it was particularly emotional because this is quite an extraordinary coincidence. My great uncle died on the 10th of May, 98 years ago. On the 10th of May this year, our grandson was born. And I find that quite eerie, quite spooky.
You hope your grandson would never get involved in something like this.
You're bringing a tear
entirely
to my
right.
eye, I'm afraid.
Entirely right.
I'm afraid. I'm afraid that's hard.
Yeah,
Yes, it's
yeah.
hard not to be emotional.
100 years later, many Australians are coming here to reconnect or to discover their long-lost relatives. As it happened, my sound recordist Mickey Breen was on his own personal journey.
Lost him. There he is. Man, CWJ.
Charles Mann. Mickey's great-uncle, Charlie Mann, died just 4 months before the war ended in November 1918. Do you look at it with a sense of pride or tragedy?
Gee, a little bit of both, really. I mean, you've got boys, and, you know, imagine what it's like for the grandmother, great-grandmother, to see,
Oh,
to get a letter.
well, it's luck for the parent, for the father.
So, in that way, you get a bit upset. Just imagine what it'd be like, you know, if you got a letter.
It does strike across time, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. I mean, it's pretty moving just being here. Seeing all those names. These are the guys they never found. I've got a little thing for him here.
Charlie Mann, in remembrance, and you've written
Not unknown.
not unknown.
I'm probably the first one in my family to be here. Of his family to come here, I'd say.
I'll leave you alone while you do that.
Thanks, Charlie. Thank you very much. See you, mate.
As for the man who reputedly started all this carnage, Gavrilo Princip, he too would die in prison from tuberculosis in 1918. Yet, back in Sarajevo, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. This Serbian monument commemorates the memory of Princip and his fellow assassins. He's a hero.
He's a hero, yes, for the Serbs. Until the end of time, he will, for the Serb people, he will be hero.
Gavrilo Princip is named after his great uncle. He runs this petrol station and motel on the outskirts of Sarajevo, and he feels the original Gavrilo is a scapegoat. Do you think when he fired that bullet, he started World War I?
No, personally, I think that everything was prepared in advance.
He was the trigger.
Maybe, like in athletic.
So you mean like a starter's gun? He might as well have fired it in the air.
Yes, yes, yes.
Whatever the cause, the war's legacy is clear. Across Australia, every city, every country town has a cenotaph to the fallen. approximately 120,000 men, a third of those who served overseas, would die during or not long after the war. For a small country, we paid a massive price. It's a debt that will never be forgotten.
I think we're keeping a promise that we made 100 years ago, that we will not forget these people and that they are still part of our lives, of our consciousness. They formed so much of what we value as Australians.
How can we make profit, good profit, from what they went through?
I think there are lessons. I think there are values expressed. And I think that there are mistakes to learn from in every one of those cemeteries. We can only hope that they didn't die in vain.